Okay. We are now live. Okay, recording. Okay, as I said before, Gemma, I have never done this kind of thing before, so it's all new to me. And thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us. I saw you, Gemma, and you did a chat on another forum, and I just really spoke to me. You were talking about birth trauma. Yeah. And how that affects parents, and I speak a lot about how birth trauma affects children and how that is affecting them all through their lives. And I had never considered how our birth of our children has affected us, and that's coming up for us. And I talk a lot about being re-triggered into our own stuff. Mm-hmm. I would love to, if you talk a wee bit about how that works, how that birth trauma is coming back up for us as parents, and what's going on for us in those moments.
I kind of love the fact that I don't love the fact that you've not thought about birth trauma for parents, but so few people think about birth trauma for children.
Yes,
I mean, so we're kind of like the opposite way round, you know? So I am a midwife, and prior to being midwife, I was and still am an NLP practitioner. So I worked as a therapist for years and then became a midwife. And then I became a hypnobirthing practitioner, which is teaching people to use hypnosis techniques to manage childbirth. Anyway, that's kind of my background, but then I just got angry. I got angry because 30% of women leave hospital traumatized, and I got angry with how many people have birth trauma and how many people have PTSD. Mm-hmm. And that so many people are walking around having experienced a traumatic birth, many of whom go on to have post-traumatic stress disorder and have no idea whatsoever. Yeah. They know that there's something wrong with them, and sometimes, you know, they're told they've got depression or other things, and actually it's trauma. So I trained as...
Postnatal depression is often that misdiagnosed then as it's not really, it's the birth.
Of course, sometimes it is, but yeah. I see so many people who come to me and they've been treated for postnatal depression, they've been diagnosed with postnatal depression, they have a few sessions and they're 100% fine. So depression, postnatal depression, which is really depression, is a symptom of trauma. Of course, you could have depression separately.
Yes, but I do talk about how if we're left in a state of trauma for too long without expressing it, processing and understanding it, that's when it turns into depression, and it's not, you know, dealt with. It's the same theory, isn't it?
I mean, people are going to have different point of views on it, but I see trauma is the root of everything, is probably well, you know. So I co-founded Birth Trauma Scotland to raise awareness and treat perinatal trauma. So I've worked with hundreds of couples, healthcare professionals who have witnessed trauma through vicarious trauma. So that's from witnessing trauma, and birth partners have the same rate of trauma. But I also now work with, it's gone further afield, and I work with everyone from all walks of life and treating them for trauma and PTSD, regardless of what it is. Yeah. Because there is powerful, quick treatment out there. And it's just so sad. So many people, when you look out the window, are walking around with trauma, suffering, and they don't even know.
No. Because I talk about how we're being re-triggered all the time, and we then get stressed out, and I as a parent blame my kids for stressing me out. I didn't realise it was me that was stressed first, bringing the stress to them, then they misbehave, and then I blame them. Cycle would just continue. But yes, I didn't realise that all my own stuff was coming up for me in those moments.
Totally. So we all have trauma, and some of my clients, you know, I had one recently. She came to me for birth trauma, and she was like, "This is so exciting," because it was so quick. So we worked on the birth. She had post-traumatic stress disorder. Had, by her third session, she was totally cured, didn't have post-traumatic stress disorder, and she's like, right, I'm writing a list. So she literally wrote a list. You know, she's like, my relationship with my dad, you know, when this happened, I had this car accident, this time when I was bullied at school, and we wrote a list, and then we just had an appointment for each one, and then she was like, off she goes. Yeah. Fine.
Life is so stressful, isn't it? I mean, I keep trying to get through to people that they think don't have trauma.
All of us have trauma.
That's all ACEs. This happened for me when I started to become interested in ACEs and adverse childhood experience, and I could see myself in it, and I could see all my other people in my life in it, and how we're all affected.
I've got trauma, you've got trauma. I guarantee you every single person watching this has trauma, and we don't know about it, and we think trauma of soldiers of war. And it's almost a bit shameful, you know. It's like we've got better at the stigmatism of depression, but trauma, people don't even know what it is. You know, so
lived in a horrific situation to have it, don't they? If I've lived in a good family and I've been brought up well, I can't possibly have trauma. Yeah, that's not the case. Yeah, absolutely. So and we were just talking just before this about the connection obviously between the mum's trauma and the child's trauma, but also there's a lot of adopters on my group, and even foster carers who are looking after kids that aren't their own kids. It doesn't mean that, I assume that doesn't mean that they can't be triggering their own experiences that are not to do with the children in their care.
Of course.
You know, their own history is coming up, and so many adopters must have had this whole journey to get to where they're adopting. You know, with IVF, they could have had stillbirths, or, you know, all these failed attempts at, you know, having children, and that's got to have had an effect, surely. Is that
so
right?
I work with a lot of people who have been through traumatic IVF or loss, and one of the things I work on is, obviously we're working to remove the trauma, but really looking at the beliefs that these negative experiences have had on you. So, you know, a lot of people who have maybe had loss or been unable to have a child, can be quite common themes, you know, I'm not good enough, it's my fault, I'm unworthy, I'm a failure. And then when I work with them, we then look at how that affects and plays out in the rest of their life, you know, so in all their relationships, they then feel not good enough. And then obviously, depending on what the belief is, that's the kind of vibe that you put out to the world, and then people communicate back with that, so that the children that you are working with are going to communicate back with whatever is being sent out there.
Yeah, and they often have that same belief themselves. These kids have come from trauma, so they feel they're not worthy. They feel, you know, and that's that constant disconnect, isn't it?
Everyone's mirroring it back on each other.
Yeah, and we're not even aware of it. It's crazy that it's happening, isn't it?
I remember quite an interesting story, which is really about trauma. And this is just to make you realize how it doesn't need to be soldiers of war, really horrific thing. I was doing a counselling course about 20 years ago, and I'm not a counsellor, but it was a training course. And someone was explaining something called Gestalt, which basically is the connection with the root cause and all the behaviours up until then. And there was this woman that the therapist was working with, and she was successful. She was in her late 30s. She'd never had children. She'd never got married, but life was great. Apart from that, was a problem for her. And it always came back to that she was just kept on saying, I'm stupid. So she'd get to a certain thing in her job, and then she'd feel stupid. Then it would fall apart. She'd have a relationship. She'd think she wasn't good enough. And in hypnosis and using the subconscious mind, they got to the root cause. And it was a perfect life, perfect setup. She was waiting for her daddy to come home, and her and her mum had been making a little sort of afternoon tea for him. So they'd set the table, and she was about 5 years old, and she was really excited. She had her party dress on, and they had one of these old-fashioned teapots where you had to kind of heat it on the stove, and the door opened and everyone was really excited, and she ran to the kettle to pour the tea, to put her hand on it. And at that split moment, her mum obviously thought she was going to burn herself, and she went, "Don't do that, you stupid girl." And that's what ruined her whole life. Which is very scary, isn't it? Because you're like, "I've ruined my child."
Yeah, and that mother's just reacting from her stress and fear, isn't she? Yes.
But that's all it took at that moment. So just to illustrate, you know, how then that played out in her whole life. So we all have traumas, and one of the ways, if you don't know what your trauma is to really look at what negative beliefs we hold about ourselves. And then when you know what the negative belief is, you can start working out where it comes from, and then you can heal the root cause. I
talk a lot about how important it is to start to even just see what it is and understand it in the moments with your children, so that you can say, right, okay, I see what that is, I'll deal with that later. But I now know what it is, and just understanding it. And I talk a lot about looking back through your generations and seeing that pattern that you're bringing, you know, that when you're in that moment of stress, your mum's voice comes out of your mouth and you say the things that you're like, that lady obviously did in that moment with her daughter, you know, and just start to change that cycle, because we just repeat, don't we? And also there's a lot of, obviously, we talk a lot about the internal things we tell ourselves. Say the negative things that we say. And you talk to yourself in ways you would never talk to your friend, or, you know, you say such horrible things. You call yourself such terrible things, don't you? Yeah. But like you said, this isn't just for, because I think when I shared your information, I don't know if people just thought it was for only birth trauma.
Yeah. No. So, well, first of all, as far as birth trauma Scotland goes, it's for all perinatal trauma. So not just birth trauma. It can be for, you know, failed IVF, to loss, to postnatal trauma, to breastfeeding trauma, to all sorts of things. But then I also work with everyone too. So I suppose it's grown arms and legs and through word of mouth. So, you know, I've worked with people you know, men who have been sexually abused, to, you know, attacks, to car accidents, to literally anything. Because it's the same physiology. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. No. So you don't qualify to have trauma if during the event you felt unsafe enough. So obviously what we were talking about earlier was sort of negative beliefs you have about yourself. That's not necessarily going to be,
no, yeah, not the
you know, that's different to trauma. But it's really in a situation where your innate emotion, so I believe our most important emotion that needs to be fulfilled is our feeling of safety. And I do believe that's actually an emotion. And trauma happens when we feel our safety is corrupted, when we feel we're not safe. So in those instances, obviously that's when we're meant to go into fight or flight. So we fight the predator who's making us feel unsafe, and we run away from it. So that's fine, that's great. That's when we release adrenaline. But trauma happens when that didn't work. So you've tried to get away from the trauma, you've tried to run away from it, and fight or flight didn't work. Then you tried to freeze didn't even work. So that's when trauma happens.
That's in line with everything. I mean, I talk about the importance of making our kids feel safe. That's where their trauma is lying, and they need to feel that they can come and express how they're feeling and get it out, talk about it. And we tend to shut those behaviours down as parents because they make us so uncomfortable and they bring all our stuff up. So it's the same theory that you're talking about. So any trauma. And so what is the process then? Obviously hypnosis is involved.
Yeah, so I've obviously been a therapist for 20 years. I have lots of different things under my belt, but I suppose to understand how we treat trauma, or the way that I like to treat trauma, is by understanding how trauma happens. So I suppose if I explain a little bit about that, and hopefully that might help people understand some of their own triggers. Yes. So as I was saying, when you go into fight or flight, the purpose of fight or flight is to fight the predator, run away from it. But trauma, fight or flight is meant to be short-lived. So if there was a fire in the room you were in right now, Suzanne, you'd see the fire and you'd be out in the street within seconds. Yeah. It's designed to be short-lived. We're not meant to function at that level physiologically. You know, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, your pulse increases, the adrenaline increases, your immune system goes down, which is why stress is so bad for us. So that's fine. And then we go to place of safety. If we don't, that's trauma. So trauma is one thing, but trauma doesn't necessarily mean you've experienced something traumatic. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be left with lasting trauma, because 80% of people go on to process a traumatic event within 4 to 6 weeks.
That's how you move past it, isn't it? The processing.
How you move past it. So what I like to do is look at how we naturally heal trauma and then just simulate it. So what happens in that 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to be running over it in your head again and again. And when you went into fight or flight, there's a bit of your brain, it's the size of a walnut and it's the shape of the almond at the back of your head. It's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is what fires when you go into fight or flight. So this experience is stored in there, okay? And then in the 80% of people in the 4 to 6 weeks after the traumatic event, they have some funny wee dreams at night. That's basically how it works. As you go into sleep at night, you go into deeply relaxed state. A lot of you will have heard of REM sleep, REM sleep. And when you go, the purpose of this is to sort your filing cabinet. Your subconscious mind, 95 to 99% of your brain is totally subconscious, you're not aware of it. And that's where all your files on everything are. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a friend, I know who that friend is, I know how I feel about her, and I can reference and talk to her. Oh, remember that time we did whatever? I'm getting all that information from my subconscious mind. So when we go to sleep at night, you make up a funny wee dream about the traumatic event, whatever it was. It might not necessarily be specifically to do with that. It might just represent that. It might be, you know, an elephant at the beach with your school teacher with the way you felt or something. And you dream it. And this is when we're in REM sleep, the hippocampus is engaged, which is in the middle of our head, and it's the memory making bit of the brain. So I call it like the librarian, because it puts things in the right places. It's put files in the right places. So it's moved it from the amygdala, the fight or flight center, into the hippocampus. And once the dream process is complete, this could take a few weeks, days of dreaming, it'll move to the neocortex, which is at the front of your brain. And that is when it becomes a normal functioning memory. Okay, so that's when you look back on it, you'll be like, that experience was rubbish. But anyway, what were you saying? Because you're not bothered. As opposed to, when I think about it, I'm triggered. So 20% of people will keep it in their amygdala, basically. And that's when we experience trauma. So what I do is look at how the brain naturally heals it and simulate it. So when you're in the 20%, the problem with the amygdala is that it's not being processed. So it doesn't process as present tense, past tense, or future tense. It only processes present tense. So that's why it feels like it really be happening. So anyone who's listening to this, if they, you know, it could be anything from a car accident to if they've been abused, walking past the abuser's house, to someone who's had a birth trauma, going past that hospital or talking about it.
Yeah, we talk about senses triggering it all the time: smell, sight, sound, touch, taste. You're back in
senses. Yeah, absolutely. So to illustrate this, I had a dad who his partner had a very traumatic birth. I won't go into details because you don't need to know that. But during the trauma, they were diffusing this lavender. Oh. And then whenever he smelled lavender, he was starting panic attacks. Amazing, because
you're kind of weird that was happening.
Amazing. The brain is a pattern matching organ. Okay, so the 20%, it's stuck in the amygdala. It's going to say, do you know what, Suzanne, that was so traumatic. I'm never going to let that happen to you again. So I will be in high alert. I won't process it. And that way you'll always be that little bit closer to the emergency buzzer. So you can go into fight or flight, and hopefully you can fight that predator this time. And we'll be always looking out. So if anything reminds you, so if the person there had ginger hair, then when you're at the supermarket and see someone with ginger hair, you won't even realize, and suddenly you're feeling angry at the checkout. You've not even realized that you recognize the person. It's your subconscious mind that has. So then you're trapped. So trauma is, when it's post-traumatic stress disorder, literally it's everything that happens when you're in fight or flight, on high alert all the time. You can't get out of it. You're hypervigilant, you're jumpy, you're going over the story again and again and again, you're anxious, you're angry. So that's post-traumatic stress disorder, but there is a spectrum, and we all have a level of trauma, not necessarily up to PTSD, of things that are stuck in our amygdala, which we're pattern matching for. So that's why what you're talking about, when, you know, when a carer is caring for a child, they're getting triggered.
And of course, the child is in that all the time. A child with trauma is in that state. Our children's behaviors are coming off of that fear and that high layer. That's what I talk about. And just hearing you say it, it makes, you know, that's what's happening all the time. Tiny wee things, because people often say, well, nothing happened, it just went off. And there's a trigger, there's something happening that's triggering it, and they're in that moment again and again and again, and that's where the behaviors are coming from.
And it's really interesting what you're saying, that you teach parents how to care for children's trauma. So I teach healthcare professionals and birth partners how to keep a birthing woman calm, and to keep her getting out of fight or flight. And actually, we should talk about that sometime, because they're probably quite similar techniques. And the thing is that there's 3 stages to fear. And this is really interesting for, you know, people who are looking after their kids, is that the first stage of fear is, well, I'll tell you about the second and third first. The second stage of fear is fight or flight. If fight or flight doesn't work, we go into freeze. But there's a way that we can stop going to fight or flight. So therefore, our children go into fight or flight. And that's called social engagement. So a child feels they're freaking out. The first thing they will do is they'll look to their community, they'll look to their caregiver, and they'll see, basically, they'll gather the information. I'm scared, should I be scared? And if what is being reflected that is calm.
Oh my God, this is so much what I say.
Then they're not going to have to go to the next stage of fear. They can stay calm. So I always use the analogy of a good birth partner. So also a good carer is like an air hostess. You know, when you're in a long haul flight and there's turbulence, and you're like, what's the first thing you look for? Because there's social engagement.
All the time.
Air hostess. And if the air hostess is just chatting away with her high heels or whatever and pouring some Bloody Marys, you're like, I'm fine. Anyway, what were you saying? But one time I was in a long haul flight, and there's an air hostess sat down in the chair with her seatbelt on, and I can remember she was tapping her foot like that, and she was freaking out. So what did I do? I freaked out. So it's the same for the parents that you work for. If they're freaking out, their child's going to freak out. So social engagement, and we can stop a lot of triggering with social engagement. So that's why Yeah, it's really important. And there's so many ways to do that, but we're always subconsciously looking for danger. I am right now, and so are you. Like that never goes away. We're always making sure that we're safe, for listening with all the senses and everything. And that's what these children are going to be doing. And obviously if they've experienced previous trauma, they're going to be more high alert. So basically the message has to be back. You're calm, you're safe, you're calm, you're safe. Yeah. So sorry, I digress.
Yeah, no, I just, what you were talking about, it links into what I talk about with the kids. It's the same thing.
So
yes,
the way I handle it, that was the question. Sorry.
Your process,
process that I do, I have lots of things up my sleeve, but really what happens is understanding how neuroscience works and how the brain naturally heals it. So when you go into REM sleep, you go into theta brainwaves. So we are in different brainwaves throughout the day. Right now, myself, people watching this, and yourself, Suzanne, you're most likely in beta brainwaves, which is when you're alert. As you become relaxed, you go into alpha brainwaves, and then as you become deeply relaxed, you go into theta brainwaves, and then and that can be when you're in sleep during REM, or also when you're deeply relaxed, when you're awake. That's that in-betweeny, when you have a massage, you're like, oh, I don't even know where I went. It's that kind of feeling. And then there's deep sleep, right? So when you're in REM, you're in theta brainwaves. Okay. And when you're in theta brainwaves, the hippocampus engages, the memory-making bit of the brain. So what I like to do is to get the memory-making bit of the brain, the hippocampus, to engage. So what I'm trying to do is the amygdala is like holding on to that memory, because if I let go of it, you might miss a trick. I use deep relaxation, guided visualization, hypnosis to get someone deep levels of relaxation. Same brainwaves as you do when you go into REM, the hippocampus engages. That's the memory making bit of the brain. So making it into a memory is the key to cure trauma. So then basically when they're deeply relaxed, I'll get them to re-experience in a different way the trauma that happened. So the amygdala is like, what? That's really weird. Like Suzanne's experiencing that trauma, but she's deeply relaxed. I thought, because I'm a pattern matching organ, I thought she'd freak out in that. And the hippocampus is like the librarian up here going, please give me that memory. I've been trying to file that memory for ages. And the hippocampus is going, no, but actually I'm quite relaxed. Okay, there you go. Gives it to the hippocampus. We process it, go over it again and again and again in a deeply relaxed state. And then it just moves to neocortex. And it is a bit weird, but people afterward are a bit like, oh, I had someone a couple of days ago and she had PTSD, and I did the trauma processing session with her, and I was like, how are you? And she was like, I'm just fine. I'm not bothered about it anymore. She was like, I think I'm just fine. That was like straight after. So yeah, then we moved to we just do exactly the same thing. So I use different forms of hypnosis, visualization, different trainings I've got. And there are other things as well. So I'm then going to look at the fallout of the beliefs and stuff and work on changing beliefs. And there's another thing called EMDR, which you might have heard of.
Is that the eye tapping?
Yeah,
it's very powerful.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which uses bilateral stimulation, and that's recommended in NICE guidelines. I do use that, but I find I've got other techniques that are a lot more powerful, so I'll kind of use a bit of that in conjunction. So whatever I use, it's techniques to move it via the hippocampus to the neocortex. So then when people come back to a session with me, I'm like, how do you feel about it? And a lot of them, it's a very sort of somatic thing. They'll say, it was here before, it just feels further away. It feels like it's in the past, rather than it being in them all the time. And then, like, I remember someone I worked with, she had a very traumatic birth, and whenever she heard an ambulance going by, she lived in the centre of Edinburgh, she'd have a panic attack. And she messaged me about a week later going, oh, guess what? I heard an ambulance and I felt happy, so the triggers are gone. So as soon as you move the trauma to via the hippocampus to the neocortex, become a normal functioning memory, the triggers just disappear.
First, you help people recognize whatever it is that is causing it first, because often now I'm assuming they don't even know.
Sometimes, sometimes they don't know what it is. Yeah, wow. And I have different ways to find out what it is.
So ideally, if somebody had this done, then if they were living with children with trauma, they could be then more calm. And because like what you're saying is happening with my kids, when I'm able to stay calm and present with them in these horrific triggers moments, that's when they can work through this and feel safe. And then it hopefully can move that part of the brain. Take a lot of time, so feeling safe when this is coming up. Totally. But that's what changes it and heals that trauma. Totally. The parent can be calm, like you said. I keep remember how it starts with us. We have to hold that space and stay calm first before we can attend to these kids, because a stressed out adult can't calm a stressed out.
And also, one of the things I teach at my birth workshops is about, you know, how important the birth partner is in breathing. So for example, when I teach breathing techniques, what will happen is everyone's breathing goes into rapport with each other. Now that's a survival instinct.
Okay.
So if you try and breathe slowly together, I never tell people to do it, but I end up saying, well, what happened? I would say 80-90% of people say, oh, we started breathing together. So the reason for that, and this goes back to that kind of parent-child situation,
is that breathing all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm with you right now, right, you're the child, I'm the mum, and you look at me and I'm like, if I'm stressed, from a survival point of view, you're saying to yourself, she's seen stress, so she's getting ready to keep herself safe and go into fight or flight, or she's become the predator. She's either become the predator, because otherwise, why would we be increasing our breathing rate? Why would we be becoming stressed? So if children are seeing us stressed, the message to the primal bit of their brain is, she's become a predator, or she's seen a predator. So in which case, to keep myself safe, I better go into that state. So I can either run with her or him to a place of safety, or if the carer is the predator, then I can fight the predator. Now, often the carer is just stressed because life is stressful, or they're triggered. So yes, so breathing is huge, but that's why it's a survival instinct to match states.
That's wonderful. That's really perfect. And I talk a lot about keep doing your breathing and just letting your kids see you doing your breathing, doing it around them. Don't even force them to do it, because I find my kids tend to do it with me when I do it. They're a bit resistant at first, and I say, it's fine, I can breathe for both of us. I'm calm, and then the next thing you hear them breathing away with you.
And you don't actually even need to teach them, because we naturally go into rapport ourselves. So the teaching, for example, so I teach birth preparation, but I also teach stress management, resilience and trauma for the Scottish Courts Tribunal Service. And interestingly, it's pretty much the same thing I teach. And, you know, it is very much about, you don't necessarily tell people breathe slowly. If you do it yourself, just the law of the fact that we have to match physiology to keep ourselves safe. So if you go into a room full of people and they're stressed, what do? You feel stressed. That's really sensible, because if you're sensing stress from a survival point of view back thousands of years ago, if you go into a room of people who are stressed, that means they're either about to fight a predator or run away from us. So you should do the same. So we need to notice when we're being triggered by other people's stress, but we also need to make sure that we're not being the one that's triggered. And if children are more sensitive to this, you know, so we can go the other way by really breathing, not even saying anything to them. So many times I've had a woman in labor, she's freaking out, or I've also been, you know, happened to be on the street as the first person who's first aiding, not saying anything, just being calm and breathing. It doesn't take long till they do it.
So much when we're stressed, don't we? And I just say nothing, just breathe. That's what my mantra, and just exactly what I'm saying. Oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant when you talk to people and they just say exactly the same, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just physiology. It's just understanding physiology.
But the thought that it's happening anyway, you don't even need to teach them it. They'll just do it. I talk to teachers about coming into the class when they're all coming in from school and they're all hyper excited and wound up from playtime, and so just teach her do the breathing. If you can get the kids to do it, great, but just do it yourself. Like you say, you're reducing the stress in the room.
The world is a reflection of yourself.
And it's such a simple thing. It's almost too easy, isn't it? I was really resistant to breathing for a long time. Now, I believe it's actually changing my brain.
And the thing is, their respiratory system, all other systems in your body are totally subconscious. So if I try and get my heart to lower because I'm in fight or flight, I can't. If I try and get my adrenaline levels lower, I can't change any of the systems in my body. But their respiratory rate falls somewhere between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind. So when all other systems are totally subconscious and you can't control them, in general, their respiratory rate just falls into the background and reflects your emotional state. But human consciousness is such that you can recognize when you're in stressed out breathing pattern, and you can change your breathing. It's the only bit of your physiology you can change. And as you breathe slowly, your brain's like, oh, she's breathing slowly. There's obviously not a predator. Oh, okay, I'll increase the immune system. I'll lower the heart rate. And then we're in the relaxation response. And because it's physically impossible to be in fight or flight and the relaxation response at the same time.
Yeah, well, I talk about how you can't be either coming from a place of fear or you're coming from an open place of love. You can't be, it's the same theory, but different wording around it, but you can't be both. So stop,
physically impossible.
and open and be open and connected, because we shut down and we disconnect from each other when we're all stressed, and I talk about that all the time. Oh, this has been great. So what would somebody do if they were interested in having a session with you, Gemma, or having a wee chat with you? How would they
So just to email me. So if you, I mean, I can share my contact details to email me or send me a message on Facebook, and yeah, we can have a chat. And obviously, you know, I've got the Birth Trauma Scotland website, but I do work with all kinds of trauma, and where I normally work with people over 3 sessions. That's it. So even people with complex PTSD after years of therapy. I'm never going to say never, but so far I've never not had a success rate, you know, a successful case. So our first session, we do a lot of information, get the story, understand how it's affected your beliefs, and then explain a lot about the trauma and how I'm going to treat it. And then the second session is the trauma processing. And then we have a bit of a week in between each session. And then the last session, basically you go off and live and basically see, you know, put yourself, subject yourself to your previous triggers and see how you are. Most people come back and they're like, I'm fine now. Some people, there's a few cobwebs, so we have a wee tinker with them. And then I do the kind of forward planning, you know, like building you up after trauma, and everyone will get at least 2 hypnosis guided relaxation tracks, which are lovely because they're totally created, recorded, edited for my clients. So with specific suggestions and your name in it and everything like that. So lovely to listen to before you go to sleep, to get a good night's sleep and stuff. But at least one of them will be to work on in the background in between the sessions on supporting the releasing the trauma as well. So yeah, just get in touch.
Yeah, what I'll do is when I share this, I'll put your details, I'll obviously link into your Facebook group.
Thank you, yeah. And any questions, you know, if there's something I've not explained, fire away.
Underneath this link, when I share it, if people can ask questions, I'm assuming you'll see them, and if you want to answer them, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I love how what we're doing, it's so funny how it's just really similar, you know, like the way that I would teach a midwife to care for, you know, a birthing woman, or also someone in the Scottish Courts Tribunal Service, you know, to care for a victim, you know, it's the same way in which you would be teaching in many ways, you know, a parent to be caring for their child, or a carer to be caring for their child.
Yeah, absolutely. It's brilliant when it all comes together like that, I think.
Totally.
And I often, when I listen to new people, I'm always hungry for more information, and I'm open to learning that I'm wrong. You know, I'm always like, right, okay, listen to this. Like when I came on to your last one, and I love it when it often always it lines with what I believe anyway. So
yes, it's affirmative, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
I think people get a lot out of this. This has been really helpful. I really appreciate your time.
My absolute pleasure.
Okay, so I'm going to shut us down, and I'll hang about.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much for coming on.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hang on. Yes, I want to.